All right, so today we're diving into a conflict that's really at the heart of, well, almost every major headline you see. It's this constant battle between a simple, powerful story and the complex, often messy, data that sits right underneath it. We're going to see how this clash plays out in everything from the economy to our most important institutions.
To really get our heads around this, I want to start with this fantastic quote from the financial writer Morgan Housel. He says that pretty much everything, every investment, every policy is just a number from today multiplied by a story about tomorrow. It's that combination of a hard fact and a human story, and that's exactly what we're going to pull apart today.
So here's how we're going to do it. First, we'll get into the psychology of why stories are so darn powerful, especially with money. Then, we're going to look at three really different examples: economic tariffs, foreign policy, and what's been going on at the Department of Justice. And finally, we'll wrap up by talking about how we can all get a little better at navigating this noisy world.
Okay, let's start with that story part of the equation. Why is it that narratives have such an incredible grip on us, especially when it comes to something that feels like it should be all about logic and math, like money? Well, the answer is realizing that finance isn't just about spreadsheets. It's about people. I mean, think about it from Housel's perspective. You can't understand something like the 2008 financial crisis just by reading an economics textbook. No way. You have to understand the human side of it. Stories people were telling themselves. This belief that the housing market could just go up forever. And that right there, that's our first big takeaway. To understand chaos, you have to understand the human stories driving it.
This is such a great way to think about how markets work. In the short run, the market is a voting machine. It's basically a popularity contest. It's all about hype, memes, the story that catches fire. And in our world today, that short run can last for a really long time. But eventually, the market becomes a weighing machine. Sooner or later, the fundamentals, the cold, hard reality, they always take over. All of our examples today are about that tension, that moment when the voting stops and the weighing begins.
All right, let's put this idea to the test with our first case study, economic policy. We're going to look at what happens when a very simple, very appealing story about tariffs slams right into the complicated reality of a global economy.
So the story here, it's simple, it's powerful, and honestly, it sounds pretty good, right? The idea is if you put tariffs on goods from other countries, it'll force companies to bring factories and jobs back home. It's a story of strength, of rebuilding. But this is where that simple story starts to collide with the numbers. I mean, just look at this. These are the real increases in tariffs on everyday stuff. Toys, they go from a 0% tariff to over 22%. That's a huge jump. And that cost has to go somewhere, right? Either you pay more for it, or the businesses trying to sell it take a massive hit. And then you get a quote that just perfectly sums up the problem. This comes directly from a US company. And what are they saying? They're saying that because of the tariffs, they have to make permanent changes. And what are those changes? Reducing staff and moving more manufacturing offshore. It is the literal opposite of what the story promised. And it doesn't stop there. The ripple effects just keep spreading. A big furniture chain goes bankrupt, the Federal Reserve starts reporting that costs are rising for manufacturers all over, demand at food banks goes up, even tourist spots see their revenue drop. It's a classic example of how one simple story can create this incredibly messy, complicated reality on the ground. Okay, let's switch gears and look at foreign policy. Because guess what? We see the exact same pattern here. You have these powerful stories of being tough and decisive, and then you have the complex, often unpredictable results.
I mean, you can't get much clearer than that, right? The story is one of total control, of being tough, of just shutting things down with a single declaration. It projects this image of absolute, decisive action. But almost immediately, the numbers started telling a completely different story. As this action disrupted the supply lines, the price of cocaine on the black market reportedly shot up by as much as 45%. So the action designed to show strength actually created this massive economic shockwave, which in turn can make the whole business even more profitable for those who succeed. And of course, analysts saw exactly where this was headed. You jack up the price, and what happens? You can see more crime from people trying to pay for it. The potential profits get bigger, which could actually attract more people into the trade. So in the end, that simple, tough narrative didn't get rid of the problem, it just made the math of the problem a whole lot more dangerous.
All right, for our last example, we're going to look inward at a really important American institution,
the Department of Justice. And here, the battle of narratives is between a public story of reform and a very different internal reality described by the people who work there.
So the public narrative, the story being told, is that the department has become this politicized swamp and that it needs a deep cleaning to restore fairness and impartiality. That's the story.
But on the inside, a very different story started to emerge from career staff. Here's a senior advisor, Peter Kerr, saying he'd never seen anything like it. Prosecutors being targeted not for doing something wrong, but just because the leadership didn't like the case they were working on. And that feeling of something being wrong just grew. Katie Chambly-Ryan described it as an alarm blasting everywhere. Think about that. The fear was so real that people started having secret meetings to figure out their legal rights in case they were fired or pushed out. And this is where you see the real long-term cost. Gregory Rosen calls it a brain drain. You have prosecutors with decades, even a century of combined experience, all leaving. The institution itself might survive, but it's being hollowed out, losing all that expertise.
This quote from an attorney inside the Civil Rights Division just hits the nail on the head. It perfectly captures that internal reality. They said their job changed from finding the facts, wherever they lead, to finding facts that would fit a story that was already written. It's the total opposite of the public story about restoring impartiality.
So, we've seen this pattern play out in economics, in foreign policy, and even inside our own government. So what do we do with this? How do we even begin to sort through this constant clash between the stories we hear and the numbers hiding beneath them? And this is where we come full circle, back to Morgan Housel, who gives us the key to why this all works the way it does. He points out that our own life experiences are this teeny, tiny fraction of everything that's ever happened, but they make up maybe 80% of how we think the world works. We latch onto stories that fit our personal model of the world because there's nothing more convincing than what we've seen with our own two eyes.
You know, this bias is so strong, it even messes with how we think about the past versus the present. We tend to look back at the past and see it as a clean, finished story. It feels safe because, hey, we know how it ends. But the present, it just feels like pure chaos, this constant storm of bad news and uncertainty. And that feeling makes us incredibly vulnerable to simple stories that promise to fix the chaos.
And so that leaves us with the big challenge, right? We're all human, we're wired to love a good story. That's not a bug, it's a feature. The real work, the hard part, is developing the habit of pausing and asking a few questions. Okay, that's a great story, but what do the numbers say? What happens next? What part of the story am I not being told? The goal isn't to stop believing in stories, but to get really, really good at weighing them against the cold, hard facts.